Perfect. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here this morning with all of you. It's been a few years since I've done actually a presentation for the symposium, although the last time was online, so it's nice to be able to do this in person. And today I'm going to be presenting on preparing for the physical tests. Now, I'm not going to be talking specifically to any one test, as some of you have had discussions with earlier during the networking. You can see on our side there are several tests that you can do. Although there are similarities between each one of them, some are harder than others. How you approach each one might be a little bit differently, but what's necessary for all of them is having a very strong, not necessarily strong, but certainly a solid foundation of not only cardio fitness, but strength fitness, but as well familiarity with these tests. I'm predominantly going to be focusing a bit more on the cardio and strength side of things, but if there are questions at the end that's a bit more specifics about the test, we can definitely cover those aspects. So again, my name is Marc Locquiao. I am the owner and operator of Redline Conditioning, where we specialize in preparing applicants for the POPAT test, the PARE test, the SOPAT test, and the COPAT test. We have also helped some applicants who are in the process with RCMP getting ready for the new test that they've implemented, the PFA test, which I believe stands for Police Fitness Assessment, is that right? Yep. So we have been helping some applicants with that as they get ready for depot. For those who are potentially looking at BC Sheriffs, they also have a new test aside from the SOPAT called the SOFAST test. And the APREP test, although it's not a test that's done here in BC, it is something that we've helped out with on occasion with anyone who may be looking at applying to perhaps Calgary or Lethbridge. So if anyone here is thinking of heading out that way, we've done some APREP training as well. A little bit more about myself. I like to swim, bike, and run, otherwise known as triathlons. If you've never done a triathlon before, I like to say that they are quote-unquote fun. But just because I like my endurance training doesn't mean I'm a stranger to the weight room. I do like to lift heavy weights up and down off the ground. My favorite music of choice is hip-hop, particularly golden era hip-hop. Next slide. I'm going to go a little quick on this one. Oh, that's all right. I'm originally from Montreal, so go Habs go. Even though we're not doing all that well this year, still always going to be a Habs fan. My favorite color is blue. And when I'm not at Redline, I do like to spend quality time with my young family here. All right, so just moving on. When it comes to preparing for these tests, I generally find there are three main components. You got the skills training component, you got the strength training component, and you got the cardio training component. Now, depending on where you are in the process, so if you have applied to an agency or if you haven't, these components are going to be emphasized differently. So just because you see it as an equal distribution here, within your training program, it's not going to be equally distributed. You may be focusing more on cardio at one point, perhaps at another point you're going to focus more on strength training, and perhaps at one point, particularly if you have a test coming up, you're going to focus a bit more on the skill training component. Actually, just quick show of hands, how many of you here have actually done any of the tests that I've listed out here, like POPAT, COPAT, SOPAT, so some of you. All right, good. And so for those who've done it, you understand how crummy you're going to feel by the end of the test, right? It's not a pleasant feeling, and it's not meant to be a pleasant feeling. These are tough tests. They're meant to be tough. And so when we're preparing, we want to make sure that we, as I mentioned earlier, we have a strong foundation of fitness, particularly cardio, but of course, strength training as well. And so the first component I want to cover here will be the cardio training component. In my opinion, and speaking specifically towards the test, your cardio fitness is going to be the most important one. It could potentially be the determining factor of how well you're going to do on these tests. It is the foundation and the basis for all these tests. I mean, you go online and do a search for POPAT, PARE, COPAT, whatever it may be, there's going to be some kind of running component to it. So you have to have a good level of cardio fitness. And when you do have that good level, and especially a high level of cardio fitness, you make these tests a little bit easier on yourself. Now, not to say the tests are easy, I'm just saying it's a little bit easier. You give yourself more room for error as well, especially if you've never done a test before. I always like to say, the first one you're going to do is going to be the worst one you're going to do, simply because you don't know what to expect. And so if you don't know what to expect, you want to give yourself room for error to prepare. Now, there are many ways to prepare your cardio. You can run, you can bike, swim, use a rowing machine, use the elliptical, assault bike, do aerobic classes, spin classes, whatever the case may be, anything that's going to elevate your heart rate and keep it up for a sustained period of time. And generally speaking, it's got to be a lengthy period of time, at least 15, 20 minutes. So for those of you who may only do strength training and consider a 10-minute easy jog on the treadmill before your strength training, it could be considered cardio, but it's usually not enough to be able to be ready for these tests. Most times, just keeps right here right now. Most times when people come to me in terms of when they ask a question, how do I improve my cardio? What they're really asking is, how do I improve my running? Because even though I listed out multiple ways you can train your cardio, each one has their own specificness to it to prepare. So throughout this presentation, when I'm talking about cardio, I'm predominantly talking about your run fitness, your run cardio. Because you gotta run. No ifs, ands, or buts when it comes to these tests, you gotta run. And even when you are on the job as an officer at some point, you're likely going to be running. So you want to have running as some kind of basis within your own training program, particularly when it comes to preparing for your cardio. So strength training component, the next one. I already said that in my opinion with cardio, I believe it's the foundation. It's the most important in determining your success for the test. And the reason I say that is over strength is because with strength training, as important as it is, if you solely focus on strength, you're not going to do as well as you think you're going to do for the test. If your cardio is lacking. If your cardio is lacking, you're not going to be able to express any strength that you do have. I don't care if you can bench press 225 pounds for many, many reps or lift 500 pounds off the ground. If you're dead tired after running the obstacle course, you're not going to express that strength very well. So strength training, yes, it is important, but it shouldn't necessarily supersede the importance of conditioning training, at least when I'm talking about within the context of test preparation. Now, in terms of the style of strength training that you do, it doesn't necessarily matter. You could do bodybuilding, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, could be bodyweight training only. The main thing is whatever style that you choose, be progressive with it. Lift a little bit heavier as you improve. Lift more reps as you improve. Become more technically proficient as you improve. That's what you should be aiming for with the strength training. I mean, again, it will have an indirect effect on how you're going to do for the tests, in particular for something like the push-pull machine or the bag carry at the end. But in general, it doesn't necessarily matter which style you choose. Just choose something, get better at it. It will help with your test overall. Next slide. Skill training component. Just taking a bit of a step back here. So cardio fitness, strength fitness, that is going to be the bulk of your training. And that's where a lot of focus should be throughout most of your training history, if you will. But a forgotten aspect, or perhaps a neglected aspect, or maybe just not thought of aspect, is the skills component to these tests. And the reason I have skills as a component is because preparing for these tests is not unlike preparing for a sport. Let's take basketball as an example. You can be the most fit person in the world, but if you don't know how to dribble a basketball, if you don't know how to shoot a basketball, pass a basketball, go for a rebound, whatever specific skills basketball has, if you don't have those, you're not going to be a very good basketball player, despite whatever high fitness level that you have. To be the best basketball player, not only are you going to have the fitness, you're going to need the skills as well. So again, training for these tests, whichever test it may be, is not unlike training for a sport. Each aspect of the test has its own uniqueness to it, its own skill set. The push-pull, as an example. It's not just a matter of push that weight in, keep it in, and move. There's a certain way of how you do it. Jumping over the vault, although for the most part you can jump over however way you can, there are some specific ways of jumping over it that's going to make it easier. Same with the controlled falls, getting up and down off the ground from your front or from your back. There are ways of getting up and down in a way that's more effective that I find most people tend to waste a lot of energy. How you do the mat jump, how you run the stairs, how you do the hurdles, how you pace yourself on the obstacle course. These are all things that on the surface doesn't seem important, but when you're in it, and for everyone here who has done a test, you already know what I'm talking about. Until you're in it and doing it, you don't realize how much there's really involved. So the skill training component is an important component to the training, and I'm actually just reminded right now of something that happened a few months ago. We had this one person who had come in for their official POPAT test, and they'd never done the POPAT at all. So they're going into an official test, no experience whatsoever, which is something I do not recommend to you guys at all. Definitely want to have at least one practice before you do your official test, and as mentioned earlier, you want to do it as soon as possible. But back to the story here. This person comes in, no experience, and they're asking us at Redline, what's the fastest POPAT time here? Because I'm going to beat it. And they even said to the recruiting officer that they're basically going to try to beat the fastest time at Redline. And just as a side note, fastest time recorded at Redline for the POPAT is 2:49. What ended up happening with this person was they failed their POPAT. And not only did they fail, they didn't even finish the test. Out of a group of, I want to say about 7 or 8 people, this was the only person not to pass their test and to fail. So just imagine how embarrassing that is, to claim you're going to get the fastest time and then fail in front of everybody and a recruiting officer. Kind of reflects poorly on this person. But there is a bit of a happy ending to this particular story. They came back to us for some more training sessions, get themselves familiar with the tests, learn how to do the machine well, learn how to pace themselves correctly on the obstacle course. And so about a month later, they retested and ended up getting, if memory serves correct, 3:10, 3:11 or so for the POPAT, which is a really good time. That's just outside the top 10 fastest times done, at least at Redline. I can only speak to Redline. And someone who's pulling off a time that's in that low 3-minute range, it is very clear that they had the cardio fitness to be able to run quickly and sustain that speed all throughout. It's clear that they had the strength because they were able to get through the machine much more effectively. But we were able to give them that skill component as well, so that they can actually express their full potential on the test. So they had that foundation, they had the cardio fitness, they had the strength. Now they got the skills to go with what I like to say, the cherry on top, right? So the skill training itself, although it may not necessarily be done throughout all parts of your training, it is something that you don't want to neglect at any point. But there is points where you do want to emphasize, and I'll get to it here shortly. We'll move on to the next slide. So I mentioned earlier, what component you focus on is going to depend on where you are in the process. Now, I believe when Doug asked how many of you were in the process, there was only a few hands that were up. So let's go to the next slide right now. If you're not in any kind of process, if you haven't applied to anyone as of yet, that's a good thing. You have time on your side. You have time to work on your strength, work on your cardio fitness, develop it to at least some kind of minimum level to know that when you do apply, you're going to be ready if someone told you you have to run the POPAT the next day. But in terms of where are you going to focus your training, one of the things you want to do first is to perform some kind of benchmark test. Now I'll cover that, what some of those benchmark tests are shortly, but essentially you do a test, if you see strength as your weakness, then perhaps you start off with strength training as a focus to begin your training program. Now, this isn't to say you're always going to be doing strength training. At some point, you may switch it over and focus a bit more on cardio and then maintain your strength, but this is just as an example. Or perhaps cardio you find is your weakness, so you start with the cardio and eventually work on strength. But the benchmark test is just going to help determine which direction to take with your training program. So time is on your side, and you want to make sure you take full advantage of that time. Now, if you have applied to an agency, depending on where you've applied to is going to still affect what component you're going to focus on. If you've applied to a federal agency such as RCMP or CBSA, generally speaking, you have months to prepare for your tests. You know, the process with them does take a little bit longer. So if you are if you're looking at the screen here, if you're on that left side of the branch, you kind of follow a bit more similar to as if you weren't in the process at all. So perform a benchmark test, figure out if strength or cardio is your weakness, and go from there, figure out which is the one you want to start off with. But if you've applied to a municipal agency, and I'm going to clump BC Sheriffs and BC Corrections into the mix here as well. So if you've applied to a municipal agency like Surrey Police, PPD, Delta, New West Transit, you're going to have a shorter timeline to prepare for your tests. So you're not necessarily going to need to perform a benchmark test because you're going to have no choice but to focus more on the skills and the cardio component of the training. Whatever strength training you are already doing, just try to maintain it at that point. You're going to have to try to boost your fitness levels as quickly as possible and get familiar with the tests as quickly as possible. Because now it will depend on which agency you apply to, but chances are you could be running your test within 2 to 8 weeks after you apply. Even 8 weeks might sound long, but it's not an appreciable time to really develop your fitness to the best of your abilities. But you do what you can at that point. And so you want to hope that you've already developed a foundation of fitness before you apply to any municipal agency. So again, if you're thinking of applying to a municipal, don't start your fitness training when you apply. Start well beforehand. See where you stand with your training, see where you stand with your fitness, and I would even try to run a practice test. I mean, we run testing sessions at Redline quite regularly, but I will say we're not the only organization to do practice tests. There are others out there as well, but you can certainly come to us for all of that. But again, I just want to emphasize that if you are looking at municipal, these things can move quickly. And time again, we have people come to us saying, my POPAT is next week. I haven't done one before. Can you help me? And if we're getting swamped with others who are also in the same boat, we may or may not be able to help you. So because many of you now aren't in the process, this is actually a good time to try to figure out where you are, because you can develop the fitness and become more and more familiar with these tests. All right, moving on. Now, one common mistake I see a lot of people make when preparing for these tests is doing too much too soon. And this is typically those who are going through a municipal process. Again, it's coming down to, I have my tests in a few weeks' time. I'm just starting my training. And so what do? They start running every single day. They start doing a lot of high intensity work. And they will see an increase in their fitness, but it's going to come at a cost. You're wearing your body down too much because you're doing so much volume, so much intensity that the body doesn't have time to adapt to the training and recover and become better. So again, going back to creating that strong foundation of fitness. If you have a strong foundation of fitness, you can gradually ramp up yourself to a proper level instead of trying to do everything all at once. We had a gentleman come to us a few years ago, and he was applying to an agency where at the time they used to do the 1.5 mile run. And because he didn't have that running background and he wasn't doing much running when he applied, he would run the 1.5 mile almost every day and try to run it as fast as possible. He would get better, but he started plateauing. So he came to us for training. The issue though, when he came to us, is he was already starting to he was already starting to suffer from shin splints. And I'm pretty sure there's probably going to be a few head nods here of people who've suffered from shin splints. Yes? No? Maybe so? I see some smiles, so I'm going to assume that you've probably experienced it before, and those are not fun to have. With this guy, it got so bad that he had to pull himself out of the process and get surgery on his shins because there was so much pressure in there. And that's all because he was trying to do too much too soon. He wasn't giving himself that time to adapt to the stresses of running and progress his fitness abilities. So, too much too soon, something you want to avoid. You want to lower your chances of injury. Now, I mentioned performance benchmarks earlier, and so we have a few here. If you're at the back, it may be a little bit hard for you to see, but the first two pertains more towards being able to test your cardio fitness. So I use the 1.5 mile standard or the beep test standard. You don't necessarily need to use both of them. You can just choose one. For the 1.5 miles, if you're trying to figure out what kind of distance that is, very easy, 6 laps around a high school track. That's going to give you the equivalent distance. If you can run that in 12 minutes or faster, that is a good place to be at in terms of your cardio fitness. If you're going to use the beep test, what I would suggest is the 20-meter beep test or the léger shuttle run. There are other variations of it, so you want to make sure you're using the right one. So it's the 20-meter one. Level 7 as a minimum or higher, again, is a good place to be at in terms of cardio fitness. And again, you don't have to do both of them. Choose one or the other and test yourself on the regular. Maybe once a month, maybe once every 2 months. See where you're at. Because you may not have the opportunity to run a POPAT practice or a PARE practice very often. So at the very least, you want to see where you are with your fitness. Because with these standards, this will give you an idea if, from a fitness perspective, you're ready to tackle the tests. Now, I should note, what I have up on here pertains more so towards the POPAT test. And the reason I had it more towards the POPAT test is because the POPAT, in my opinion, is the hardest test out of all of them. And if you can get through the POPAT test, you can most definitely get through any of the other tests. So if you're not doing the POPAT test and you're doing one of these standards, so let's say the 1.5 miles as an example, maybe you're preparing for the PARE test. You may not necessarily need to hit 12 minutes, perhaps 13 minutes is okay. Even 14 minutes, I would say, your cardio is at a good enough level to be able to pass the PARE. In terms of strength, I have 3 tests here. There's push-ups. If you can do at least 10 strict push-ups, and I mean strict push-ups, so doing it on your toes, getting full extension of your arms, getting really low down to the ground, not these partial ones here, keeping your body nice and strict, a nice plank as you go up and down, so not pushing your butt up into the air, not sagging your butt towards the ground. 10 strict push-ups is a good standard to try to hit for. Dead hang pull-up hold, so holding onto a pull-up bar, hang on, see if you can do that for at least 20 seconds. And a vertical jump chest, jumping 16 inches, minimum or higher. These are good standards to try to aim for. Now the vertical jump test, that is simply jumping up as high as you can. Trust me, that was not 16 inches. This is not a box jump. It is simply jumping straight up into the air. And I choose these standards not because these are the gold standards, but because they are easy to implement and they can be done anywhere. You could use something like a 1 rep max to test your strength as well, nothing wrong with that. But that usually means that you're proficient in strength training at that point. Some of you may not have experience with strength training, but for doing something like push-ups, dead hang pulls, vertical jump tests, they're easy to administer, can be done anywhere. Now, hitting any of these benchmarks isn't going to be a guarantee that you're going to pass your test, but it increases your chances of passing. I mean, I told you that story earlier of the person who came in and failed the first time and passed the second time. They had the fitness. They would have been able to hit any of these standards, but they didn't have that skill component. So that can be that X factor, whether or not you're going to pass your first time around. All right, moving on. Now, in terms of workout types for cardio training and specifically running, I like to break things down to 3 categories: interval training, steady state training, and sprints. With interval training, we're building up our stamina. With steady state, we're trying to build up our endurance, and then through sprints, we're going for pure speed. An easy way, sorry, stay on there. A very easy way to set up a run program is just to do one of each. You have 1 day of interval training, 1 day of steady state, 1 day of sprints. Most people tend to do either steady state training or interval training. No one really actually does sprints, even though someone comes and tells me they do sprinting, like they'll do interval training and they're sprinting each set. In my opinion, that's not actually true sprinting, but that's getting into a bit of semantics. But most people will tend to do interval training or steady state, but incorporating some amount of sprints is a good thing to do as well. Because you're working on that pure speed, and if you're already developing other aspects of your running fitness, that pure speed could help translate to running faster for longer distances and so forth. In terms of interval training, it's not only high intensity training. High intensity intervals is not the only way to do intervals. You can do moderate intensity intervals, you can do low intensity intervals. Basically, interval training is just a way of saying you do a period of work followed by a period of rest. Moving on. So a few sample run workouts from each category. When it comes to intervals, you can either do time-based intervals or you can do distance-based intervals. So what I mean by that is time-based intervals would be something like running for 30 seconds, walking for 30 seconds, or resting for 30 seconds. Maybe it's a minute of running, followed by 3 minutes rest. Could be 5 minutes of running, followed by a minute rest. The duration you can play around with. It can be long, it can be short. Most people tend to do something like a time-based intervals. I'm a little more partial towards distance-based intervals. I like to know the distance that I'm going to be covering. It allows me to learn how to pace myself more effectively for a given distance. But distance-based intervals could be something like a 400 meter run, or you think of it as 1 lap around a high school track. Rest for, I have here 3 minutes, but it could be 2 minutes, it could be 1 minute, could be longer, depending on how fast you run your intervals. Could be run half a lap, walk half a lap. Maybe you do that should be 200 meters, but maybe you do a 200 meter run. Again, the distance doesn't necessarily matter. You're just running a certain distance and then followed up by rest. Steady state, pretty straightforward. You're running the same pace the entire time, but you could also do a progressive pace where you start off slow and then you gradually get a little bit faster as your body warms up through your run. But for the most part, it's still a relatively low intensity effort. And then sprints could be 8 seconds long. You could be using hill sprints, could be flat sprints. Maybe you're doing 40 yards, 50 meters. It's something that's going to be shorter in duration. The other thing with sprints though is if you are going to do sprints, you want to make sure you have a lot of recovery time in between. Because you're essentially going at minimum 90% of maximum effort. And if we actually put percentages on all of these, steady state, think of it as 50, maybe 60% of your max effort, something that allows you to go for minimum 20 minutes at a time or longer. With intervals, whether it's time-based or distance-based, you're probably looking at about 70 to 80% of your max effort, but you're never, at least when it comes to interval training, you're never going max effort on it, whether it's distance-based or time-based. It's going to be hard, but you want to make sure that your effort is about the same from one interval, not effort, but your speed is roughly the same from one interval to the next. So if I use 400 meters as an example, let's say you run that first 400 meters in 2 minutes, then you rest 3 minutes. Your second one, maybe around 2 minutes, maybe a minute 59, that's fine. Then you rest. By the third interval, maybe you're a little bit faster, maybe it's 1:58, or you're still maintaining 2 minutes. Essentially, your speed is going to be about the same from one interval to the next. You're just going to have to work a little bit harder to maintain that speed. That's what we want to do with interval training. We're not trying to max out our efforts on interval training. It's not an effective way of building up your cardio and your stamina. Yeah. Now, alternatives to running. You can do biking, use the assault bike, swim, water running. I mentioned earlier during the cardio training component, there are multiple ways of training your cardio. If you do suffer from shin splints, while you're trying to get a run training program in. This is a way to still try to get some kind of cardio training in without putting impact onto your body. Because the thing with running is, as great as it is to develop your cardio fitness, it is hard on your body, which is why you want to be progressive and gradual with how much running you do in your training program. But there are alternatives to running, and the interval types or workouts that I placed here for running, you could even apply it to biking as well, or swimming. So you can do distance or time-based interval for biking, steady state for biking, even sprint style on the bike. You can apply that to these other means as well. All right, next one. This here is a sample of some strength exercises. I essentially on the top row here have 5 categories that you can choose from. You got presses on the far left, pulls/rows, hip dominant, knee dominant, core rotation type exercises. And then under each one are exercises that would fall under those categories. So presses would be things like bench press, push-ups, shoulder press. For the pulls/rows, those would be things like obviously rows, pull-ups, pull-downs, anything you're doing a pulling motion of. So the first 2 would be more upper body type exercises. With hip dominant, those would be things like your deadlift exercise, kettlebell swings, glute bridges, hip extensions. A lot of the hip dominant exercises are going to be working this backside here. Knee dominant exercises would be things like your squats, your lunges, step ups. Core rotation exercises would be things like your planks, Russian twists, sit-ups, so forth. If you really want to keep things very simple, if you haven't done any kind of strength training before, below here would be an example of a strength workout you can put together. You simply just choose one exercise from each category, and then you do that exercise. So perhaps you do the deadlift as your first exercise, and you do 4 sets of 8 reps. Once you've done all those sets for the deadlifts, move on to the push-ups, do X number of sets, X number of reps, so forth and so forth. Keep it simple. Don't need to make it complicated. Here, this is just kind of showing a sample training cycle. So for example, if you discover that your cardio fitness is what's lacking and you want to focus on that, then in the first month, you want to try to create a base. If we're looking at running and you haven't run before, perhaps you're only doing, let's say 3 days of running, 20 minutes each time. If you can, try to run it the entire time, take minimal walking breaks, but if you have to do some walking breaks, take the breaks. As you progress though, you can go longer with those runs, or shorten those rest times, or eliminate the walks entirely. You can start incorporating intervals into the mix, a little bit more speed training into the mix as well, and that's how you can start to progress from one month to the next and the next. Again, this is if you're focusing more on your cardio. If it's a bit more strength focused, the idea is still the same thing. Create a base in that first month or first few weeks, and as you get stronger, lift a little bit more in terms of weight, lift a little bit more in terms of reps, aim for progressing yourself. And then just getting a little bit more on a weekly basis. Let's say you're on a cardio focus here. Perhaps you're in the phase 3 or month 3 of your training. There's 2 days of recovery here, 2 days of intervals. There's a steady state. So essentially when it comes to running, there are 3 days dedicated to running. There is 1 day that's included into a strength workout where you do sprints. But as you can see, this one would be more cardio focused. Doesn't mean no strength training is done. You still want to be able to develop or work on your strength, or at the very least maintain your strength if you're working on your cardio. And again, this is just an example. This isn't the way to set up a training week. It is just a way. I just want you to kind of take a look at this, and hopefully it kind of spurs on some ideas of how can you set up your own training, because it's going to be individual for each person. This strength focus here, I'm showing a 4-day split. Maybe you do a 3-day split. Maybe you do a 6-day split. There's no right or wrong answer. Again, this is an example, giving an idea of how you can try to set things up. Cardio is still in this phase, as you can see. In this case, if I had this person doing cardio, it would be just steady state training. I wouldn't necessarily have them do a whole lot of high intensity stuff, because they're going to be putting a lot of effort into the strength workouts themselves. Now, skills to practice. I mean, ideally, the best place to practice the skills is at a place that offers testing, so shameless plug, we do that at Redline. But a lot of these things can be simulated on your own. So vault jump itself, you don't necessarily need a vault. You can get a little bit more creative. If you know someone who can build something for you, cool. I used to use those aerobic steps. I just put it up to the 3-foot height, jump over that. That's one way you can do it to work on your jumping skills. You can work on how you do your controlled falls, how you get up and down from the ground, from your front and from your back. The mat jump, that can actually be a big thing for people. In the POPAT test, it's a 5-foot jump that you have to clear, same thing for the PARE test. And it could surprise people in terms of difficulty of jumping over something like that. So if you can't jump 5 feet, learn how to jump 5 feet. Incorporate some of that into your training. Same thing with the hurdles, same thing with the bag carry. Push-pull is the trickiest one to be able to simulate on your own. The machine itself is quite unique. Really the best way to train on the machine is the machine itself, but there are ways to be able to simulate it. If you want to know how you can simulate the push-pull, I do have a video on YouTube talking about ways to simulate the push and ways to simulate the pull. It's not the exact same, but it is better than nothing, and it allows you to think about how to actually do the push effectively. Because again, as I mentioned, these things have their own unique skill set, so to know how to do things in the correct manner makes a huge difference. We've seen people shave off at least 30 seconds from their first test to their second test because after the first test they learn how to do things correctly and they know how to do it correctly. So a lot of time can be shaved off in a short period of time if you know how to do these skills correctly. So some key takeaways from today. Give yourself time to build your fitness. Fitness, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard this before, and maybe this will be the first time you're about to hear it, but fitness is a lifestyle. It is not a means to an end. When you're looking at a career at law enforcement, the job itself, now full disclosure, I've never been an officer myself, but this is just from conversations I've had with officers and redliners who've become officers. The job itself may not be physically demanding 99.9% of the time. But that 0.1% of the time that it is physically demanding, you're gonna need your fitness at that point. And there's that saying, better to need something and not have it than to have it, you know what I'm talking about? Basically, you need your fitness. When you need it, you're not hoping that, oh my God, I should have been doing training this entire time. No, you want to know that in any kind of emergency situation, you're ready for it, okay? Start making fitness a part of your lifestyle, even if it isn't now. And even if it's not, quote unquote, the best program, maybe your fitness at this point means walking 3 times a week. Great, do that. What's that?
I just say our foot tours.
Foot tours. Let's start somewhere and then progress from there, all right? Again, many of you didn't put your hands up when Doug asked if you're in the application process, so this is your time to build a strong foundation of fitness. Aim for those benchmarks that I mentioned. If you can get close to those benchmarks, you know that from a fitness perspective, you're close to passing your tests. And then us at Redline can give you that next component, the skill training component. And then speaking of the benchmarks, even if you can hit those benchmarks, aim to do better. Don't just settle for doing the bare minimum. Avoid TMTS, the too much too soon, right? You do that, you're going to get yourself into trouble. You're more likely going to injure yourself. And then incorporate some kind of skill training into your programs as well. You don't have to do it all the time. Maybe it's only one skill that you try to incorporate, but at least have some kind of familiarity with what to expect when it comes to the tests. Next slide. All right, any questions? None? So we're located in Langley on Fraser Highway, Fraser and close to basically between 224 and 232nd. Yeah. So in terms of we're mostly session-based training. We have morning sessions between 8 and 12 o'clock, Monday through Friday. We also have evening sessions between 5 and 8:15 from Monday to Friday as well. We also have Saturday morning sessions. Most of our training is group-based training, whether large group or small group, but we also offer private training. Those, though, would have to be scheduled outside of our group sessions, but private training is an option as well. The only day that we're not open would be Sundays. Any other questions? No.
If we book for the task, it's only like some certain days opening or every day is opening for the task?
So if you're looking at the official test itself, we have one day that we do it, and it's always on Saturdays. Yeah. If need be, we could set up a private session to do your official test as well, but in terms of on the regular, we do those on Saturdays. So if I'm looking at the time right now, they're about halfway through the test session. We usually run at 10:30 to 12:30 on Saturdays. Yeah. That's both official tests and practice tests between 10:30 and 12:30. Sorry, can you say that a little bit louder? I mean, we've trained some people as young as 16. We usually haven't gone any younger than that. If you're 17, 18, 19, that's perfectly fine as well.
This is your chance to ask questions. Marc's a wealth of knowledge.
Oh, I can go off on any of these tests.
Can you do the test?
I can still do it now. I can actually walk the test, all of them. Which I wouldn't recommend, though, walking any of the tests. It might make it look like you're mocking the test, if you will. But it is possible to be able to walk the POPAT test. If, again, you go onto YouTube and just search walk the POPAT, you'll find my video of walking through it. And the reason I actually put that on there is because I want to show that you don't have to run the obstacle course as fast as possible. A common mistake many people will make on these tests, and I'm sure those who have run the POPAT before, the common mistake people will make is trying to sprint the 6 laps. Again, whether that's the POPAT test, PARE test, even if it's the COPAT test, sprinting is never a good idea, because usually sprinting means you're trying to go 100% effort on the test. Now, this isn't to say you don't want to go 100%, but you don't want to go 100% at the very beginning. You want to go 100% at the very end. Think of it like this. If you're to do a marathon, you wouldn't run the first 500 meters of the marathon as fast as possible. That's just not smart. You're not going to last at all for the rest of it. The idea is the same thing for these tests, even though it's shorter in nature. If you put all of your effort into the obstacle course, you have no strength whatsoever to be able to do the push-pull machine effectively. And I'm speaking more towards the POPAT and COPAT and SOPAT. By the time you get to that 3-foot vault at the very end, it's a lot of times people don't even know that they got through the test by the end, because they're just so drained. They can't safely get over the bar or do those controlled falls effectively. And really, I mean, some of you might be listening to this right now and just going, yeah, sure, whatever. But trust me, you do it the first time, even if you pace yourself the first time around, once you put it all together, you'll realize that there's more to these tests. And it's a lot more demanding than you realize. So, yeah, don't underestimate these tests. Don't take them lightly. They are challenging.
Should you eat anything before you run the test?
All right, should you eat anything? I mean, you could. Probably depends on what you eat. Generally speaking, I would say no, but again, it might depend. If it's a quick bite of a granola bar, and I would say just one actual bite, that should be fine. But if you're having a full-on meal half an hour beforehand, or even if it's something like a protein shake half an hour beforehand, I would not recommend that. It's just not going to sit well in your stomach. So in terms of when to eat before your test, If you're going to have a big meal, make sure it's at least 2 hours prior to. If you're still feeling somewhat hungry beforehand, keep it small. Maybe it's a granola bar, maybe it's a piece of apple, perhaps a banana. But yeah, you definitely don't want to have a big meal beforehand.
Just remember that when you're having lunch today, in case you feel like running today.
Yeah, who wants to run the POPAT after? Anybody? I got one hand. 2 hands, 3 hands. All right. Is there time for more questions or time to wrap
I
up?
think we're just about ready to wrap.
All right. Maybe one more question, perhaps? All right, time for one more question. All right. Well, if you do have any... Oh, sorry.
What's the oldest person you trained?
Oh, that's a good question. I would probably say 54, maybe 55. This gentleman was preparing for the PARE test, and I believe they were in the process with CBSA.
Wow.
Yeah.
See, there's hope for us. Well, maybe not me. Well, Mark, I want to thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. If you want to find us, social media, we're mostly on Instagram here, RL Conditioning. On YouTube, if you search Redline Conditioning, you're going to find a lot of our videos on there, and you can also visit our website, rlconditioning.ca. But thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and feel free to ask some more questions afterwards.